Theses Vienna, December 6, 1896. I have now adorned my room with plaster casts of Florentine statues. It was a source of extraordinary invigoration for me. I am thinking of getting rich, in order to be able to repeat these trips. A Congress on Italian soil. Naples, Pompeii. Most cordial greetings to you all. Yours a young archaeologist, Norbert Hanold, had discovered in a museum of antiquities in Rome a relief which had so immensely attracted him that he was greatly pleased at obtaining an excellent plaster cast of it which he could hang in his study. 18. I have long grown used to being dead. 1917. Letter to Wilhelm Flies, December 6, 1896, complete letters 214. These words conclude a long letter in which Freud defines the relations of topographic, archaeological, or archival stratification among several types of recording, 3 and probably more, he thinks then. This letter prefigures the note on the mystic writing pad, at times in the details SE 19, 227-32. 18 Freud, Delusions and Dreams in Jensen's Gradiva, 1906-07, SE 9, 10. We will quote this translation henceforth, occasionally modifying it. 19 Ich habe mich schon lang daran gefeiben, Tatsache sen. Jensen, Gradiva, cited by Freud. Let us pretend to recapitulate where a recapitulation seems impossible, when nothing any longer can reunite itself right in close to the head, to the principle, to the arc, or to the archive. Let us thus recall the idiomatic formulas which we claimed could only print themselves so economically in the French language. They express archive fever. Elle on se garde de l'autre, we said. And elle on se fait violence. Elle on se garde de l'autre pour se faire violence, the one keeps, from, the other for making itself violence because it makes itself violence and so as to make itself violence. In another language altogether, is this not what Freud would perhaps have replied? Is this not, in substance, what Freud's spectre for which no one here wants to be substituted would perhaps have declared to Yerushalmi? So the father of psychoanalysis and of Anna did not take into consideration the question concerning what his daughter in effect wrote, in his name or in her name. The content of the response to such a question was already archived, at least in the letter to Enrico Morselli, as early as 1926. But he did perhaps respond in that way, in the form of an ellipsis, to the question of the future of an illusion, in sum. The question of the future of the spectre or the spectre of the future as spectre. Who wants to substitute him or herself for Freud's phantom? How can one not want to, as well? The moment has perhaps come to risk, in a few telegrams, a thesis on the subject of Freud's theses. The thesis would first say this: all the Freudian theses are cleft, divided, contradictory, as are the concepts, beginning with that of the archive. Thus it is for every concept, always dislocating itself because it is never one with itself. It is the same with the thesis which posits and arranges the concepts, the history of concepts, their formation as much as their archivization. Why stress spectrality here? Because Yerushalmi dared to address Freud's phantom. Because he had the audacity to ask him for a confidential response whose archive he would never unveil? Undoubtedly, but in the first place because the structure of the archive is spectral. It is spectral a priori, neither present nor absent in the flesh, neither visible nor invisible, a trace always referring to another whose eyes can never be met, no more than those of Hamlet's father, thanks to the possibility of a visor. Also, the spectral motif stages this disseminating fission from which the archontic principle, and the concept of the archive, and the concept in general suffer, from the principle on. It is known that Freud did everything possible to not neglect the experience of haunting, spectrality, phantoms, ghosts. He tried to account for them courageously, in as scientific, critical, and positive a fashion as possible. But by doing that, he also tried to conjure them. Like Marx, his scientific positivism was put to the service of his declared hauntedness and of his unavowed fear. Let us take only one example. I shall choose it from up close to archive desire, from up close to an impossible archaeology of this nostalgia, of this painful desire for a return to the authentic and singular origin, and for a return concerned to account for the desire to return, for itself. This example calls me back close to Naples and to Pompeii, in the landscape of Gradiva, where I wrote these pages some 10 days ago. In his reading of Jensen's Gradiva, Freud avows being himself haunted. He denies it without denying it, he defends himself without defending himself. He fends himself, if you will, at the moment he wants to account for the last evolution of Hanold's insanity, 1, the haunted insanity of someone else and of someone else as a character in fiction. The latter thinks that he speaks for a whole hour with Gradiva, with his midday ghost, Mittagsgespenst, though she has been buried since the catastrophe of 79. He monologues with Gradiva's ghost for an hour, then the latter regains her tomb, and Hanold, the archaeologist, remains alone. But he also remains duped by the hallucination. What will Freud do? He had first clearly posed the classical problem of the phantom. And of the phantom in literature. The character is not the only one to be ill at ease or to suffer from attention, Spannung. Faced with the apparition of Gradiva, we ask ourselves in the first place, we the readers, who it is, for we have I-85 first seen her in the form of a stone statue, and then of a fantastical image, fantasy build. The hesitation does not oscillate simply between the phantom and reality, effective reality, Wirklich. Putting it in quotation marks, Freud speaks of a real ghost, ein wirkliches Gespenst. Is she a hallucination of our hero, led astray by his delusions? Is she a real ghost? Or a living person, leibhaftige person? 17 To ask oneself these questions, Freud notes, one does not need to believe in ghosts. The question and the tension it engenders are only more inevitable in that Jensen, the author of what he himself calls a fantastic fiction, Fantasiestuck, has not yet explained to us whether he wanted to leave us in our prosaic mode or if he wanted to transport us into another and imaginary world, in which spirits and ghosts Geister und die Gespenster are given reality. Wirklichkeit 17, my emphasis. We are prepared to follow the author of fiction as in the examples of Hamlet and Macbeth. Let us never forget it, at midday, at the hour of ghosts, Geisterstund, Gradiva, the midday ghost, appears for us in an experience of reading, but also, for the hero of the novel, in an experience the language of which, indeed the multiplicity of languages, cannot be abstracted away to leave naked pure perception or even a purely perceptive hallucination. Hanold also addresses himself to Gradiva in Greek to see if the spectral existence, Skindasian, has retained the power to speak, Sprachvermogen. Without response, he then addresses her in Latin. She smiles and asks him to speak in his own proper idiom, German. If you want to speak to me, you must do it in German. A phantom can thus be sensitive to idiom. Welcoming to this one, allergic to that one. One does not address it in just any language. It is a law of economy, once again, a law of the oikos, of the transaction of signs and values, but also of some familial domesticity. Haunting implies places, a habitation, and always a haunted house. This economy is no longer separated from questions of effectivity, thus in quotations, is a phantom real, worklich, or not? But also of truth. What about the truth for Freud, faced with these specters? What, in his eyes, is the share, the allowance, the part of truth? Because he believes in something like a part of the truth. He tells us that under analysis, under psychoanalytic examination, this delusion's lack of verisimilitude, die Unwahrscheinlichkeit dieses Wahns, seems to dissipate, scheint sie auszugehen, at least to a large extent, the greater part zum grosseren Teil 70. So here is a lack of verisimilitude which seems to dissipate with explication, at last in large part. What is this part? What is it due to, this piece which resists explanation? Why this insistence on the part, the parting, the partition, the piece? And what does this partition have to do with the truth? We know the Freudian explanation. Announced by this strange protocol, it mobilizes the whole ideological machinery of psychoanalysis, beginning, obviously, with the mechanisms of repression. But we should not forget that if the psychoanalytic explanation of delusion, of hauntedness, of hallucination, if the psychoanalytic theory of specters, in sum, leaves apart, a share of non-verisimilitude unexplained or rather very similar, carrying truth, this is because, and Freud recognizes it himself a bit further on, there is a truth of delusion, a truth of insanity or of hauntedness. Analogous to that historical truth which Freud distinguishes, notably in Moses, from the material truth, this truth is repressed or suppressed. But it resists and returns, as such, as the spectral truth of delusion or of hauntedness. It returns, it belongs, it comes down to spectral truth. Delusion or insanity, hauntedness is not only haunted by this or that ghost, gravita for example, but by the specter of the truth which has been thus repressed. The truth is spectral, and this is its part of truth which is irreducible by explanation. A bit further on, Freud attempts again to account for this part in the hallucinatory haunting of the archaeologist. If a patient believes in his delusion so firmly, this is not because so geschieht das nicht his faculty of judgment has been overturned and does not arise from what is false irrigist in the delusion. On the contrary, there is a grain of truth concealed in every delusion sondern in jedem steckt auch ein Kornchen Wahrheit. There is something in it that really deserves belief laist etwas in ihm, was wirklich den Glauben verdient, and this is the source IQ of the patient's conviction, which is therefore to that extent justified or also so weit berechtigt in Avers UI 87 Gung de Kranken. This true element dies as war, this truth, the truth seed of truth, however, has long been repressed war lang Zeit verdrängt. If eventually it is able to penetrate into consciousness, this time in a distorted form in Enstelieder form, the sense of conviction attaching to it is over-intensified as though by way of compensation and is now attached to the distorted substitute of the repressed truth Ensteligen Sursatz de Verdrängten Nullerin. 80 To decipher the archive of this score, to read its truth right on the monument of this portion, one must take into account a prosthesis, this distorted substitute. But a part of truth remains, a piece or a grain of truth breathes at the heart of the delusion, of the illusion, of the hallucination, of the hauntedness. This is a figure we find again literally in Moses, precisely when Freud distinguishes historical truth from material truth. For example, if Moses was the first Messiah, and Christ was his prosthetic substitute, Ersatzmann, his representative, and his successor, in this case, St. Paul was in a certain sense justified to address the nations as he did, Kant auch Paulus mit einer gewissen historischen Berechtigung den Eilkernzurufen, to tell them that the Messiah had in effect come, wirklich gekommen, and that he was put to death before your eyes, vor euren Augen. Then, too, Freud says, there is an element of historical truth in Christ's resurrection literally, a piece of historical truth, ein Stück historischer Ullrit, for he was the resurrected Moses and behind him the returned primal father Arbiter of the primitive horde, transfigured and, as the Son, put in the place of the Father 90. Having thus accounted for the part of truth, taken care to isolate the seed of truth in the hallucination of the archaeologist who is prey to the midday ghost, Freud means to confirm this truth of revisitation. He wants to demonstrate while illustrating. With the art of manipulating its suspense, like a narrator or like the author of a fiction, he tells us, in turn, a story. But as if it were the history of someone else, a case. Not the case of a patient, but the case of a doctor. I know of a doctor, he says SE 9:71. The doctor had seen a ghost. He had witnessed the spectral return of a dead person and he could, in sum, bear witness to it. Freud had just noted that the belief in spirits, in specters, and in returning souls, der Glaube an Geister und die Gespenster und die Wiederkehr and Seelen, should not be taken as a survival, a simple residue of religion and of childhood. The experience in which we meet specters or let them come visit us remains indestructible and undeniable. The most cultivated, the most reasonable, the most non-believing people easily reconcile a certain spiritualism with reason. We know about the Freudian intrigue on the subject of telepathy. I tried to discuss this elsewhere, in a more or less fictional fashion, and I will not go back into it. What is at issue here is an analogous problematic. Freud wants to teach with the aid of an example, Lch Weiss von einem Arzt, I know a doctor. And he tells us, as if it had to do with someone else, the misadventure of a colleague. The latter reproached himself for a professional imprudence, it may have led to the death of one of his patients. Many years later, he sees a young girl enter his office. He recognizes the dead person. He tells himself then that it is true that the dead can come back das tie toten wieder kommen kann and 71. His hallucination had been favored, it was lucky, if you will, the spectre presented itself as the sister of the deceased women and also suffered from Graves' disease. Here is the coup de theatre, the dramatic twist. Freud pretended to speak of someone else, of a colleague. If I were to be immodest to such a point, doubly immodest, I would say that he did what I am doing in speaking of a colleague, Yerushalmi, while I am speaking of myself. Freud presents himself, he says, in sum here I am, der Arzt aber, dem sich dies ereignet, war ich selbst, the doctor to whom this occurred was, however, none other than myself. 72 And he does not fail to draw a conclusion, he is in a good position not to refuse Hanold the archaeologist the clinical possibility of a brief delusion, but also the right to a furtive hallucination. As soon as a semi-spectre appears, it is also the right of manifestation of a certain truth, which is a bit spectral, in part spectral, in the person of a sort of species of real phantom. The species, the aspect, the spectre, this is what remains to be seen with the truth, what is needed to speculate with the true of that truth. In the end, Yerushalmi is right. He has managed to allow for truth's part. Freud had his ghosts, he confesses it on occasion. He I-89 lets us partake in his truth. He had his, and he obeyed them, Jacob Shalama, Moses, and a few others, as does Yerushalmi, Jacob Shalama, Sigmund Shalama, his Moses, and a few others, and I myself, Jacob, Haim, my grandfathers Moses and Abraham, and a few others. Freud's discourse on the archive, and here is the thesis of the theses, seems thus to be divided. As does his concept of the archive. It takes two contradictory forms. That is why we say, and this declaration can always translate in a vowel, archive fever. One should be able to find traces of this contradiction in all Freud's works. This contradiction is not negative, it modulates and conditions the very formation of the concept of the archive and of the concept in general right where they bear the contradiction. If Freud suffered from mal archive, if his case stems from a troubled L archive, he is not without his place, simultaneously, in the archive fever or disorder we are experiencing today, concerning its lightest symptoms or the great holocaustic tragedies of our modern history and historiography, concerning all the detestable revisionisms, as well as the most legitimate, necessary, and courageous rewritings of history. Before gathering and formalizing the double Freudian postulation about the archive, I would like to justify the French expressions I just used, the troubled L archive and the mal archive. Nothing is less reliable, nothing is less clear today than the word archive. And not only because of the two orders of the arc we distinguished at the beginning. Nothing is more troubled and more troubling. The trouble with what is troubling here is undoubtedly what troubles and muddles our vision, as they say in French, what inhibits sight and knowledge, but also the trouble of troubled and troubling affairs, as they also say in French, the trouble of secrets, of plots, of clandestineness, of half-private, half-public conjurations, always at the unstable limit between public and private, between the family, the society, and the state, between the family and an intimacy even more private than the family, between oneself and oneself. I thus name the trouble, or what is called in English the trouble, of these visions and of these affairs in a French idiom that is again untranslatable, to recall at least that the archive always holds a problem for translation. With the irreplaceable singularity of a document to interpret, to repeat, to reproduce, but each time in its original uniqueness, an archive ought to be idiomatic, and thus at once offered and unavailable for translation, open to and shielded from technical iteration and reproduction. Nothing is thus more troubled and more troubling today than the concept archived in this word archive. What is more probable, on the other hand, and more clear, is that psychoanalysis is not without responsibility in this trouble. It wants to analyze it, but it also heightens it. In naming psychoanalysis here, one refers already, in any case, to the archive which is classified, at least provisionally, under the name of psychoanalysis, of Freud, and of a few others. In other words, if we no longer know very well what we are saying when we say archive, Freud is undoubtedly not without responsibility. But the name of Freud, the name of the Freuds, as we have seen, itself becomes plural, thus problematic. The troubled L archive stems from a mal archive. We are en mal archive, in need of archives. Listening to the French idiom, and in it the attribute en mal to be en mal archive can mean something else than to suffer from a sickness, from a trouble or from what the noun mal might name. It is to burn with a passion. It is never to rest, interminably, from searching for the archive right where it slips away. It is to run after the archive, even if there's too much of it, right where something in it anarchives itself. It is to have a compulsive, repetitive, and nostalgic desire for the archive, an irrepressible desire to return to the origin, a homesickness, a nostalgia for the return to the most archaic place of absolute commencement. No desire, no passion, no drive, no compulsion, indeed no repetition compulsion, no mal can arise for a person who is not already, in one way or another, en mal archive. Now the principle of the internal division of the Freudian gesture, and thus of the Freudian concept of the archive, is that at the moment when psychoanalysis formalizes the conditions of archive fever and of the archive itself, it repeats the very thing it resists or which it makes its object. It raises the stakes. Such is the case with the 3+1 theses, or prostheses. 3 of them have to do with the concept of the archive, 1 other with the concept of concept. 1 first thesis and first Surenchère, higher bid, on the one hand, in effect, with the single but decisive conception of a topic of the psychic apparatus, and thus of repression or of suppression, according to the places of inscription, both inside and outside, Freud made possible the idea of an archive properly speaking, of a hypomnesic or technical archive, of the substrate or the subjectal, material or virtual, which, in what is already a psychic spacing, cannot be reduced to memory, neither to memory as conscious reserve, nor to memory as rememoration, as act of recalling. The psychic archive comes neither under mneme nor under anamnesis. But on the other hand, as I tried to show in Freud and the Scene of Writing, this does not stop Freud, as classical metaphysician, from holding the technical prosthesis to be a secondary and accessory exteriority. In spite of resorting to what he holds to be a model of auxiliary representation, he invariably maintains a primacy of live memory and of anamnesis in their originary temporalization. From which we have the archaeological outbidding by which psychoanalysis, in its archive fever, always attempts to return to the live origin of that which the archive loses while keeping it in a multiplicity of places. As we have noted all along, there is an incessant tension here between the archive and archaeology. They will always be close the one to the other, resembling each other, hardly discernible in their co-implication, and yet radically incompatible, heterogeneous, that is to say, different with regard to the origin, in divorce with regard to the arc. Now Freud was incessantly tempted to redirect the original interest he had for the psychic archive toward archaeology. The word archive, by the way, appears already in the Studies on Hysteria, 1895, SE 2.20. The scene of excavation, the theater of archaeological digs are the preferred places of this brother to Hanold. Each time he wants to teach the topology of archives, that is to say, of what ought to exclude or forbid the return to the origin, this lover of stone figurines proposes archaeological parables. The most remarkable and the most precocious of them is well known, in the study of Hysteria of 1896. We must once again underline a few words in this work to mark what is to my eyes the most acute moment. A moment and not a process, this instant does not belong to the laborious deciphering of the archive. It is the nearly ecstatic instant Freud dreams of, when the very success of the dig must sign the effacement of the archivist, the origin then speaks by itself. The arc appears in the nude, without archive. It 20. As I was reminded after the lecture by Danny Nobus, whom I thank, the same word also appears in Zum psychischen Mechanismus diverges Lichkeit, 1898. Presents itself and comments on itself by itself. Stone's talk. In the present. Anamnesis without hypomnesis. The archaeologist has succeeded in making the archive no longer serve any function. It comes to efface itself, it becomes transparent or unessential so as to let the origin present itself in person. Live, without mediation and without delay. Without even the memory of a translation, once the intense work of translation has succeeded. And this would be the advance of an anamnesis. The time Freud consecrates to this long voyage in a field of excavations also says something of a jouissance. He would like it to be interminable, he prolongs it under the pretext of pedagogy or rhetoric, but in order to explain the relationship between the method which we have to employ for this purpose and the older method of anamnestic inquiry, I should like to bring before you an analogy taken from an advance that has in fact been made in another field of work. Imagine that an employer arrives in a little-known region where his interest is aroused by an expanse of ruins, with remains of walls, fragments of columns, and tablets with half-effaced and unreadable inscriptions. He may content himself with inspecting what lies exposed to view, with questioning the inhabitants, perhaps semi-barbaric people who live in the vicinity, about what tradition tells them of the history and meaning of these archaeological remains, and with noting down what they tell him, and he may then proceed on his journey. But he may act differently. He may have brought picks, shovels, and spades with him, and he may set the inhabitants to work with these implements. Together with them he may start upon the ruins, clear away the rubbish, and, beginning from the visible remains, uncover what is buried. If his work is crowned with SUCI 93 says, the discoveries are self-explanatory, the ruined walls are part of the ramparts of a palace or a treasure house, the fragments of columns can be filled out into a temple, the numerous inscriptions, which, by good luck, may be bilingual, reveal an alphabet and a language, and, when they have been deciphered and translated, yield undreamed of information about the events of the remote past, to commemorate which the monuments were built. Saxa Loquantur. The Etiology of Hysteria, 1896, SE3, 192, Mymphasis J21-2. Second thesis and second surenchère, higher bid. On the one hand, the archive is made possible by the death, aggression, and destruction drive, that is to say also by originary finitude and expropriation. But beyond finitude as limit, there is, as we said above, this properly infinite movement of radical destruction without which no archive desire or fever would happen. All the texts in the family and of the period of beyond the pleasure principle explain in the end why there is archivization and why anarchiving destruction belongs to the process of archivization and produces the very thing it reduces, on occasion to ashes, and beyond. But on the other hand, in the same moment, as classical metaphysician and as positivist outclarer, as critical scientist of a past epoch, as a scholar who does not want to speak with phantoms, Freud claims not to believe in death and above all in the virtual existence of the spectral space which he nonetheless takes into account. He takes it into account so as to account for it, and he intends to account for it or prove it right only while reducing it to something other than himself, that is to say, to something other than the other. He wants to explain and reduce the belief in the phantom. He wants to think through the grain of truth of this belief, but he believes that one cannot not believe in them and that one ought not to believe in them. Belief, the radical phenomenon of believing, the only relationship possible to the other as other, does not in the end have any possible place, any irreducible status in Freudian psychoanalysis. Which it nonetheless makes possible. From which we have the archaeological outbidding of a return to the reality, here to the originary effectivity of a base of immediate perception. A more profound and safer base than that of Hanold the archaeologist. Even more archaeological. The paradox takes on a striking, properly hallucinatory, form at the moment Freud sees himself obliged to let the phantom speak for the duration of the Archeo 21. Further on, the parable becomes a comparison, with the excavation of a stratified ruins side 3, 198. Logical digs but finishes by exorcising them in the moment he at last says, the work having been terminated, or supposed to have been, stones talk. He believes he has exorcised them in the instant he lets them talk, provided that these specters talk, he believes, in the figurative. Like stones, nothing but that. Third thesis and third surenchère, higher bid. On the one hand, no one has illuminated better than Freud what we have called the archontic principle of the archive, which in itself presupposes not the originary arc but the nomological arc of the law, of institution, of domiciliation, of filiation. No one has analyzed, that is also to say, deconstructed, the authority of the archontic principle better than he. No one has shown how this archontic, that is, paternal and patriarchic, principle only posited itself to repeat itself and return to reposit itself only in parricide. It amounts to repressed or suppressed parricide, in the name of the father as dead father. The archontic is at best a takeover of the archive by the brothers. The equality and the liberty of brothers. A certain, still vivacious idea of democracy. But on the other hand, in life as in his works, in his theoretical theses as in the compulsion of his institutionalizing strategy, Freud repeated the patriarchal logic. He declared, notably in The Rat Man, that the patriarchal right, vaterrecht, marked the civilizing progress of reason. He even added to it in a patriarchic higher bid, even where all his inheritors, the psychoanalysts of all countries, have united themselves as a single man to follow him and to raise the stakes. To the point that certain people can wonder if, decades after his death, his sons, so many brothers, can yet speak in their own name. Or if his daughter ever came to life, Zoe, was ever anything other than a phantasm or a spectre, a grade of a rediviva, a 195 grade of a Zoe Bergang passing through at Bergas 19.